everyone, and welcome to the lineup. Today is February 10th, 2022. I'm Barry Stagner. And a couple of things before we jump in. I know many of you get Amir's weekly newsletter and a ministry update. And as you know, he's been having just major back problems, and to the degree that he's going to be headed home after an event that we're going to do together with Pastor Michael Lay on February 19th in Cincinnati. So if you'd like to watch online, go to the Behold Israel website, and there'll be the information there as to how you can watch online. The event is full, so you no in-person attendance if you happen to live in that area. But Saturday, February 19th, awaiting his return in Cincinnati with myself, Amir Sarfati, and Pastor Michael Lay, talking about the things that are going on in our world and how they relate to Bible prophecy. And then the next day, I'm going to be speaking at Calvary Chapel, Cincinnati. And if you'd like to join us there, that'd be a wonderful thing. I'm sure they're going to be streaming, and or you can join us in person. The service time, as you see, is at 10 o'clock, and you can come by, and love to meet you and shake your hand, or you can join us, as many do, online for the day. So again, that would be Sunday the 20th, February 20th, that is, in Cincinnati at Calvary Chapel, Cincinnati. And on the 19th, awaiting his return, also in Cincinnati, or it might be in a city called Loveland. But anyway, go to the Behold Israel site and you can find out the information there. So, well, here we go. There is a lot going on this week, and really touching all the bases, so to speak, regarding Bible prophecy, not just in Israel, but everything else seems to be active and moving forward in the realm of Bible prophecy and headed toward that moment and twinkling of an eye experience when we'll forever be with the Lord. And things that are lining up that will be fulfilled during the tribulation are happening in today's news story as well. And our first comes from the Jewish News Syndicate. And the headline reads that Iran unveils a 900-mile range ballistic missile as nuclear talks resume in Vienna. And Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps unveiled on Wednesday a new domestically produced long-range precision ballistic missile. Tehran state media reported the 900-mile range surface-to-surface Kibar Shekan missile was displayed during a ceremony that coincided with celebrations in Iran, marking the 43rd anniversary of the Islamic Revolution, according to Fars News. And listen, that 43rd anniversary is not something to celebrate. It's something to mourn. The people have been persecuted. The wonderful people in Iran have been persecuted and forced into things that they do not agree with. Their resources have been used to finance other countries and their hatred of Israel. And just a horrid thing, not something to celebrate or an anniversary to look at with fondness at all. The unveiling, the article says, also took place as nuclear talks began between world powers and Iran, resuming in Vienna. And in a telephone conversation on Sunday evening, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and U.S. President Joe Biden on Sunday discussed Iran's increasing aggression and possible steps to block its nuclear program. The conversation came on the heels of Bennett having told his cabinet that the deal being negotiated with Iran and Vienna would damage Israel's ability to deal with the nuclear program. And then he said, the greatest threat against the state of Israel is Iran. Whoever thinks that an agreement will increase stability is mistaken. It may temporarily delay enrichment, but all of us in the region will pay a heavy, disproportionate price for it. We'll talk more about that in a moment, because it isn't just Israel who is in the crosshairs of the Iranians and their proxies. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that a debate whether a new deal merits the risks that are associated with it. And prospects for a new but diminished Iran nuclear deal are increasing, prompting debate in Washington about whether an accord merits the compromises involved. Fitful negotiations on reviving the 2015 nuclear deal resumed in Vienna on Tuesday, with U.S. and Iranian officials saying an agreement could be within reach. And U.S. officials are eyeing late February as an unofficial deadline for the talks, although that could shift back in a few days if negotiators were closing in on a deal. Well, I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet, but I've got a sneaking hunch that there'll be no deal at the end of February, and it will be pushed out, not by days, but by months. But the advances Iran has made since the Trump administration exited the deal in 2018 have eroded gains for Western negotiators who have been striving to ensure Iran never gets close to developing a nuclear weapon. The Wall Street Journal reported last week that U.S. officials had concluded that under a restored deal, the amount of time Iran would need to amass enough nuclear fuel for a bomb would be significantly less than the 1 year goal under the 2015 deal. Now, this is what makes this so ridiculous. Iran has stated their intention over and over and over to destroy Israel. They have expressed their hatred of the great Satan, which is the United States, time and time again in the public arena, not hiding it, not closed door meetings, not something that was hacked and revealed to the media. They say it publicly, the regime that is, publicly and openly. They hate the United States and they want to destroy Israel. Now, how is this a deal if it simply postpones their ability to enrich uranium to a 90% level or concentration of 90%, which allows it to be turned into a weapon and mounted on one of these ballistic missiles we just talked about that they have now developed and revealed? It's just beyond ridiculous that the United States thinks that the mentality of the Middle East is the same as the U.S. and they really, really want peace. After all, they're just going about it wrong. And with the right sanction relief and all these other things, they're going to see things our way. That's not going to happen. They have an agenda that is religious in nature. They believe they have a responsibility to bring about, because they're Shiites, they believe they have a responsibility to bring about an apocalypse that the 12th Imam or the Mahdi can come back and resolve it. They believe in their eschatology that Jesus is going to come back also. They believe he's going to be married. They believe he's going to become the greatest preacher Islam has seen. He's going to basically expose Christianity and Judaism as a fraud. And then he's going to die and be buried next to Muhammad. Well, of course, that is all simply ridiculous, but that's what they believe. And that is the driving force behind their actions. And, we know that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad often viewed himself as kind of a John the Baptist character, that he was the front runner to bring about the rise of the Mahdi to power by bringing about this apocalypse. And yet the U.S. is so ignorant of reality, the leaders that is, that they are willing to go back to the table, lift sanctions that will again finance all the terror activities of Iran and their proxies by lifting them and allowing them. And if they think for one moment that they're going to stop enriching uranium because they've got a deal, they haven't paid attention to anything in the last few years. So it's just really a sad state of affairs to see the U.S. Playing such a weak role in the international theater. The Times of Israel is reporting that Republican senators warned Biden that they could block a Iranian deal, nuclear deal, as talks to revive the tattered 2015 nuclear deal restarted in Vienna on Tuesday. U.S. President Joe Biden was reminded of another obstacle, this time at home, to a smooth return to the agreement. And Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, a Republican, sent a letter dated February 7th to Biden emphasizing that the Bipartisan Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act requires the administration to submit within 5 days of any nuclear agreement to congressional oversight. We are committed to using the full range of options and leverage available to the United States senators to ensure that you meet those obligations and that the implementation of any agreement will be severely, if not terminally, hampered if you do not, read the letter co-signed by 32 of Cruz's Republican Senate colleagues. Now, the sad part about this is we know that lawlessness is going to abound in the last days. That can mean multiple things, that there just no laws to abide by, but it can also mean that laws are ignored and basically acted as though they aren't present and a means by which to govern society. And sadly, we're hearing that kind of talk, even about our own Constitution, coming out of the White House regarding this particular issue and others, where the president himself has said, the Constitution is fluid. It's always evolving. It's never static. It's always subject to, basically cultural adaptations and reviews, which is garbage. That's not true. The Constitution is written in stone. It is the Constitution of these United States. And it doesn't matter how many flips of the calendar there are since it's been written, it is our Constitution, and it is not subject to interpretation. It is subject to implementation. And the president has made it clear that he really doesn't care what the Constitution says, because he can interpret it however he wants. And the founders really front loaded it with ways to protect that through the checks and balances system that Cruz is trying to impose upon this deal, where the president is acting unilaterally, going in and negotiating a package or having his representatives do that without the approval of Congress. And we've seen this go on here in our own state of California, where this lawlessness from people in high positions who are sworn to uphold the law, enforce the law, stand by the Constitution, even as the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, has employed this emergency act to where he can act on his own. He doesn't have to go through the state legislature. He just does whatever he wants, and he does it without consulting or approval of the senators from the state of California. So, sadly, most of them are Democrats like him. And so they just go along with whatever he says. But that's not how this country is supposed to operate. But that's exactly what is going to happen in the last days. There's going to be a weakened world rulership. And as I mentioned before, Isaiah chapter 2 says, at the time that God shakes the earth, chapter 3 goes on to say that God will give them children as rulers, and their princes will be youngsters. Now, that's figurative. That simply means unqualified and incompetent. And that is certainly what we're seeing going on today. And I was actually talking with a man in Israel who runs a ministry that takes care of and helps treat victims of terror, the children of victims of terror, those who have lost a parent to Palestinian terror, those who have lost a brother, sister. And he has a place, a school, primary school, and a middle school, and a high school that takes care of these kids who've been impacted by terror. And we were chatting the other day, and he said, and I mentioned this to him about Isaiah, and he said, well, that's exactly what we're wondering. What on earth is going on over there in the United States? What are they thinking, lifting these sanctions against the Iranians, who are only going to use those sanctions to fund Hezbollah, to fund Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and all the other terror proxies that they have, and including the Houthis in Yemen. So, it's just really a sad thing we see going on in our world today. But the Bible foretold it, and we're experiencing it. And that's one of the things I think that's so caught so many of us off guard, even those who study and teach Bible prophecy and have for some years. It's incredible how quickly the world has turned around. We saw the world change on September 11th, 2001. But it was a temporary change. Now we're seeing changes in things that have been basically eternal, if I can use that word, or since the beginning of time, things that have long been understood and believed that are being reversed, and natural laws, not just countries' laws, the legal systems implemented by individual countries, but natural laws are abounding today, are being abandoned today. And that's happening in abundance. Things like, the natural understanding that inside a mother's womb is a human child. And now all of a sudden it's fetal tissue, non-living fetal tissue, who isn't actually sentient or aware and has a value of life until after it breathes air outside of the mother's womb. What a ridiculous thing. How many billions of people have gone up to a pregnant mother down through the centuries and millennia and said, when is your baby due? Nobody says, well, gee, I hope that fetal tissue becomes a baby, because it's a baby from the day of conception. And this is what the Bible teaches. Yet today, people in places of power have lost their minds, quite literally, and are following after the will of Satan, which is going to be the dominant thinking pattern during the tribulation. Now, interesting also that the Israeli National News, or a paper called the Eretz Sheva, reports that the PLO has suspended recognition of Israel. The PLO Central Council decided on Wednesday to suspend recognition of the state of Israel until Israel recognizes the state of Palestine on June 6, 1967, and its border with its capital in eastern Jerusalem. And at the conclusion of a meeting in Ramallah, The PLO Central Council issued a statement saying that the state of Palestine alone has sovereignty over Palestinian land, and that the presence of the occupation, its army and settlers on Palestinian land, is an illegal presence that must be stopped immediately. The Central Council called for the provision of international protection for the Palestinian people until it could exercise its full sovereignty. It also authorized the PLO Executive Committee to reshape the institutions of the Palestinian Authority in a manner consistent with the state of Palestine exercising sovereignty over its land. Now, again, here we have so many nations supporting this, and even the Christians getting behind this, and thinking that the Palestinians are an actual people group, which they are not. They're just Arabs, and that Israel has no right, and they came in and took land that was rightfully the Palestinians, which again is such an important reminder of why we need to know history, especially the history of Israel. 136 A.D., Hadrian, the Roman emperor, because of his hatred for the Jews, renamed the land of Israel Palestina. Palestina is the Latinized form of the ancient arch enemies of Israel, the Philistines. So he renamed the land after the Philistines in order to get at the Israelis. He did not allow the word Jew to be used. He would not allow two Jews to be seen walking together, and he killed hundreds of thousands of Jews because of his hatred for them. So listen, Palestine was previously known as Israel. And in that, if you want to look at it from that particular lens, that means the Palestinians, and even at the turn of the previous century, whenever a news report spoke about the Palestinians, they were talking about the Jews who lived in the area known as Palestine. And I'll remind you again that the word Palestine or Philistine means immigrant or invaders, and the Philistines were occupiers. They were also known in history as the Aegean Sea people. They are from the island of Crete. And they're not Arabs, they're Cretans. And they would go and invade other countries and set up colonies there, as was the tradition of many nations in that day. They were immigrants, they were occupiers. And so just to make this claim that we have the right is basically, and as Palestinians, is basically an association and admission that they're the immigrants. And our next story comes from TV Israel News, and the headline reads, Israel begins campaign against Iran. The weaker Tehran is, so will its proxies be. The announcement came from Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett during an address at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. The campaign to weaken Iran has begun, said the Israeli leader, explaining that the operation is being conducted in all dimensions: nuclear, economy, cyber, overt and covert actions, alone and also in cooperation with others. The actions will also focus on Iranian proxy groups such as the Lebanon-based Hezbollah and the Hamas, rulers of the Gaza. While rockets fired at Israel may be launched from Beirut or Gaza, the origin is Tehran, said Bennett, continuing that the weaker Tehran is, so will its proxies be weaker. The hungrier the head of the octopus becomes, the tentacles will shrink, and consequently, we will meet at our borders something much weaker. As an expected consequence of reviving the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and ongoing talks in Vienna, Bennett warned that removing sanctions and flooding billions of dollars into the coffers of this Ayatollah's regime, my friends, that means more rockets, more UAVs, more terror cells, more cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns, more of everything. By the way, not only against us, it will also be directed at our American allies in the region and our other partners. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Prime Minister Bennett reiterated that likely concessions by the international community to Iran render a salvaged JCPOA against Israel's best interest. We believe that the Iranians will continue being Iranians. We see it already now during these negotiations at a time when the Iranian foreign ministry officials sit in Vienna with the global powers. At the same moment, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps behaves as a regional bully and attacks the UAE and other locations. And again, as the article said, this is going to go on multiple fronts, even as they have in the past proven their intentions that they've stated publicly and openly. And this joint comprehensive plan of action leading to more rockets, more UAVs, more terror cells, more cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns is underscored by the fact that billions and billions of dollars have been fed into the Gaza Strip, and yet millions continue to live in a below poverty level because the people in charge, Hamas specifically, and Mahmoud Abbas, take the billions of dollars offered by the international community under the guise of having a passion for the Palestinian people. They take that money and they build tunnels into Israel with it. They buy weapons with it. They give nothing to the general populace, and they build mansions for themselves, sometimes not even within the boundaries of the Gaza Strip. And yet here we are again. We've got weakness being shown from Western powers. We've got incompetence being shown from Western powers, not recognizing that this group means nothing of what they say. They sit down at the table and they will, according to Islam, I believe the practice is tayyib. They will lie through their teeth for the sake of the advancement of Islam. And again, this group sees themselves as having a responsibility of initiating an apocalypse so the caliphate, the final caliphate ruled by the 12th Imam, can take place. And yet, Bennett hit the nail on the head. You lift the sanctions like you did, and all you're doing is put Israel and our friends under more enemy fire. Now, at the same time, it is interesting that Israel still recognizes the benefit of a relationship with the United States. And our next article comes from the Jewish News Syndicate. And the headline reads that Israel bows to U.S. pressure and freezes plans to connect Jerusalem to the city east of the capital. The planned construction of the E1 corridor could prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, says the U.S. administration. Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz and Prime Minister Naftali Bennett have ordered the civil administration in Judea and Samaria's Supreme Planning Council to halt discussions on the authorization of construction to connect the Ma'ale Adumim to Jerusalem in the E1 corridor. Construction had been planned for some 3,000 acres of largely government-owned land and was to include some 3,500 housing units. The committee began to discuss the plan, which had been frozen for years toward the end of the previous government under Likud leader Benjamin Netanyahu. Bennett and Gantz intervened in the fourth of 6 authorization stages after most of the Palestinian objections to the move had been heard, and the government directed to stop the talks, and the promotion of the plan followed the opposition from Washington and sharp criticism from the left-wing Meretz party that made it clear that it saw the advancement of construction as crossing a red line. And here's a terrible thing to have to read in the article. The United States has for years taken the Palestinian side on the issue, claiming the plan would cut off Palestinian territorial continuity from the north to the south and could prevent the establishment of a future Palestinian state. And again, it doesn't matter what the president says of the United States. It doesn't matter what 45 may have said. It doesn't matter what 46 says. It doesn't matter what the U.S. Senate says. God said that land is Israel's, all of it, including the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, or more properly known as Judea and Samaria. And this is just a ploy on the part of the Iranians and those who hate Israel to see basically a stronghold. I mean, would you want somebody who wants to kill you pitching their tent in your backyard? I mean, quite literally, pitching a tent in your backyard and then having your people who should support you give them guns and money and help them survive. I mean, it's just that ridiculous. Why in the world would they want to give up what they captured in 1967? And make no mistake that God has been for them, and they are the Israel of the Bible, as we mentioned a moment ago. And the truth of the matter is, it must just not have been the right timing when they captured the Temple Mount in 67, and that famed passage, Jerusalem, or the Temple Mount is in our hands, those famed 7 words that reverberated through Israel on that sacred eve in June 7th, 1967. Why it was given back to the control of the Muslims is beyond me. I don't understand, but it was certainly international in scope. And, God's on the throne, but he is watching over the nation of Israel. You see that with 5 nations on the eve of their declaration of statehood invading Israel, and yet Israel being the victor. You see that in 1967 when they were outgunned and outnumbered. Again, the same thing in 1973 where the Syrian forces and others, it was just astronomical, the greater number of tanks that the invading armies had compared to Israel. And yet Israel prevailed because God is for them and he's not done with them. And that's the main question I would ask people who say, why do you believe that we need to side with Israel? And why do you think that God is not done with Israel? Because the things the Bible said were going to happen in the last days regarding Israel are happening all around us. The Lord has brought them back into the land. The desert has begun to bloom like a rose in the desert. They have become a fruit exporting nation. God's hand is covering over them, far greater than the Iron Dome is helping them. The iron hand of God is watching over them. And yet here we see pressure being put on them by the United States of America to not build any further in land that is rightfully theirs. And again, this is troubling because, the Genesis 12:3 thing that is often mentioned is still, does still stand today. Those who bless Israel will be blessed. Those who curse Israel will be cursed. And we don't want any part of siding with the adversaries of Israel. We want to stay on their side and remain as a blessed people ourselves. Now, our next story is along the lines of what we've been talking about, that the concerns about Iran are not limited to the small nation of Israel. Their neighbors and others in the Middle East have a say and a concern in this as well. And Reuters is reporting that a gas cylinder explosion in Tints, Abu Dhabi, raises alarm. Now, an explosion blamed on a faulty gas cylinder in a building in the UAE, capital of Abu Dhabi, raised an alarm on Wednesday, with the U.S. Embassy initially saying it suspected a possible missile strike. The UAE, which prizes its reputation as a safe business and tourism hub, has been on edge in recent weeks after several missile and drone strikes blamed on the Houthi government in Yemen. Houthi movement in Yemen. Abu Dhabi Civil Defense said it received a report of a fire at 12:09 a.m. caused by a gas cylinder explosion in a building in a central residential area. It said there were no casualties and asked the public to follow only official news sources and avoid spreading rumors. Now, the key statement or paragraph in that article is that the UAE prizes its reputation as a safe business and tourism hub. And what they can't have is that there are now missile strikes inside residential areas or in the hotel areas where so many people would travel to. And again, what was actually the case, we may not ever know. But what we do know is that it is not uncommon, especially for Middle Eastern governments, to, as I think some lady named Clinton in a story that she got caught not telling the truth about, said she misremembered. So it's not uncommon for officials to misremember if it would taint their view, them being viewed by the international community as a safe place. Now, our next article, I'm sorry, I'm kind of doing double duty here, trying to keep the headlines in front of you and read them as well. And our next article actually comes from the Epoch Times. The U.S. is facing epic nuclear threat from China and Russia, according to U.S. General. The United States must contend simultaneously with two peer nuclear powers for the first time ever as China and Russia continue to grow and modernize their nuclear arsenals. This, according to Major General Ferdinand Stoss, Director of Plans and Policy at the U.S. Strategic Command. This is the first time ever that we've had a three-party nuclear peer dynamic, Stoss said, according to Air Force Magazine. And we have no history of this. This is epic. The comments were delivered during a talk on the modernization of the United States strategic nuclear deterrent capabilities at an annual summit on nuclear deterrence in Washington, D.C. The remarks underscored a growing anxiety about the Chinese regime and its continued efforts to become a nuclear peer of the United States and Russia. And China's communist rulership is engaged in a systematic military modernization program, of which a part is the alleged to be rapidly expanding the nation's nuclear arsenal. Satellite images revealed last summer that Beijing was building over 100 new silos for intercontinental ballistic missiles in the northwestern part of the country, and the Pentagon has warned that China could have over 1,000 nuclear weapons by the year 2030. Now, obviously, that's troubling. And, one of the big questions that often comes up is, what role is China going to play in the last days scenario? Is China in Bible prophecy? Well, we know the world's greatest superpower is not in Bible prophecy, and that is the United States of America. But does China have a role? Are they the invading kings of the East from Revelation chapter 16? And we'll talk about that here in a few moments with an interesting story that we often visit, or similar stories that we visit. But the reality is, China does have a role that they're playing right now. And that role is economic control over the world. And they have been trying to, in cooperation with Russia, move the world away from petrodollars and basically turn the world economy into their favors and oust the U.S. as the global controller of finance. And lots of other things are happening. We can't forget that we owe the Chinese government trillions of dollars for money that we have borrowed, and the trade deficit has our debt has recently just exceeded $30 trillion for the first time. The trade deficit continues to grow and grow and grow. And indeed, China is at the helm in many ways of the economic future. And some say they will take over as the world's largest economy sometime soon. And interesting to watch all these things take place. But are they the army that invades from the east? And I don't know. I have my doubts about it, and I'll tell you why here in a couple of moments. Now, our next story comes from Zero Hedge, and it falls under the same category as our last, and that is wars and rumors of wars. And Zero Hedge is reporting that North Korea boasts of testing missiles that can strike the U.S. mainland. And days after North Korea's Kim Jong-un was featured in the country's latest propaganda video on a white horse prancing around in a forest and on a beach, he's issued a new threat saying advanced missile technology possessed by Pyongyang will shake the world. The statement was issued through the DPRK's foreign ministry. It said, according to Reuters, in today's world, where many countries waste time dealing with the United States with submission and blind obedience, there's only our country on this planet that can shake the world by firing a missile with the U.S. mainland in its range. Effectively, Pyongyang said that it has the capability of launching a long-range missile to strike the U.S. mainland. There are more than 200 countries in the world, but only a few have hydrogen bombs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and hypersonic missiles, the statement continued. The specific missile in question is believed to be the Hwasong 15, unveiled as underdeveloping starting in 2017. Though it's thought to have not been tested yet, the Hwasong 15 is widely acknowledged as the North's longest range intercontinental ballistic missile. However, there's also widespread speculation that North Korea could be greatly advancing its hypersonic glide vehicle capabilities after the Pentagon was reportedly caught off guard by alleged successful test in the late summer of last year, though this is uncertain. And again, looking at the change in administration here in the United States and also in Israel, and watching the boldness of those who were basically silenced for 4 years because there were two bulldogs who were in charge of two major powers in the world. And, as small as Israel is, they have the eighth largest economy in the world and one of the most feared militaries in the world. And their pilots are legendary in the minds of many other pilots and air forces in the world. And so it's just interesting to see all this saber rattling and missile testing. The Iranians are firing them off at will. North Korea, I think, has fired off 7 already this year, testing them and now making a declaration, hey, we can hit the U.S. if we want. And we're not bound to them, even though the rest of the world does. So, again, wars and rumors of wars, part of the last days scenario that we're seeing right in front of our eyes today. Now, our next story comes from the Jewish News Syndicate, and the headline says Erdogan says that Turkey and Israel will discuss energy cooperation transporting gas to Europe. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said in a discussion over energy cooperation with Israel that would take place in March, and that on the table for discussion is a plan to work together to transport natural gas to Europe. We can use Israeli natural gas in our country, and beyond using it, we can also engage in a joint effort on its passage to Europe, said Erdogan in a January 4th report from Reuters. Now, God willing, and God to him is Allah, God willing, these issues will be on our agenda with Mr. Herzog during his visits to Turkey. He said, as reported by Turkish media. Israeli President Yitzhak Herzog plans to visit Turkey next month. Erdogan said on Thursday, and tense relations have existed in recent years between the countries as Erdogan has repeatedly put Israel in the crosshairs on a number of issues, as well as hosted members of the Hamas terror organization that rules the Gaza Strip. Now, again, this is interesting. I was thinking about this as reading the article. Back when Israel discovered the 3 trillion cubic foot Haifa natural gas field called Leviathan off of its coast, Russia ran to their aid and said, congratulations on this find. We want to help you guard it. We want to help you transport it. We will post our ships. We will build the platforms by which you can harvest it from the sea. We will do all these things to help you out. Now, again, here you've got Turkey making the same type of overtures toward Israel. You know what? Let's work on the European market together, which is Turkey has already been at odds with Israel because of Israel's development of the East Med pipeline, piping gas into its Turkey's market, so to speak. And it's also where they get some of their natural gas product from out in the Aegean. So interesting, but this is how Israel could very well access the European market as well. So Turkey says, well, you know what, why don't we just run that gas up through Turkey and we'll make sure it gets to the European markets. And just like the offer that the Russians made when the Leviathan gas field was first found. And I think this is interesting because these are the two lead invaders, along with the Iranians, of the Ezekiel war scenario. And they are going to invade because of, I believe, energy related products, because the protesting nations, Sheba and Dedan, meaning the Arab Gulf states and Saudi Arabia, are going to say, what's the purpose of this invasion if you come to take plunder and booty? And so obviously there's an economic element associated with this. And the main economic element in that particular part of the world is energy related products. So interesting to see this kind of faux olive branch offered to Israel under the guise of, we can help each other get your product to market. Now, the Wall Street Journal is reporting a bit of sad news, and that is that U.S. inflation accelerates to a 40-year high, and the consumer price index rose at 7.5% annual rate in January. Now, we do know that this is something that kind of ebbs and flows throughout the course of history. But we also know that during the tribulation, that inflation is going to get to the rate when it's paired with a global famine, to where a loaf of bread, basically a quart of wheat or barley, which is enough. Some believe that to be, some Bible interpreters believe that to be enough for one meal, is going to cost a common laborer's a day pay. A denarii. It will sell for a whole day's pay. One meal will cost you everything you work for all day. And so it's not unusual to see things go back and forth, as we'll see in this article. But what we do have to understand, there's a major drought developing in Africa. Talk of major food shortages is happening again. We know that during the tribulation, it's going to be so massive and global, even though, kind of interestingly, the angel is told not to harm the wine and the oil. And therefore, those, some believe, are basically the foods for the rich. And so there'll be a great discrepancy between the rich and the poor. The poor will have to spend a whole day's pay just to eat one meal, while the wine and the oil are untouched, and people in charge continue to live in the lap of luxury. But this story says that U.S. inflation accelerated to a 7.5% annual rate in January, reaching a new 4-decade high as strong consumer demand and pandemic-related supply constraints kept pushing up prices. The Labor Department on Thursday said the Consumer Price Index, which measures what consumers pay for goods and services, was last month at its highest level since February of 1982. When compared with January a year ago and higher than December's 7% annual rate, inflation has been above 5% for the past 8 months. The so-called core price index, which excludes the often volatile categories of food and energy, climbed 6% in January from a year earlier. That was a sharper rise than the December 5.5% rise, the highest rate in nearly 40 years. On a monthly basis, the CPI increased to seasonally adjusted 6% last month, holding steady at the same pace as December. Now, this I thought was interesting. Used car prices continued to drive overall inflation. Get this, rising 40.5% in January from a year ago. Used car prices rose 40.5% in 1 year. A sharp uptick in housing rental prices also contributed to last month's increase. Food prices surged 7%, the sharpest since 81. Restaurant prices rose by the most since the early 1980s, pushing up by 8%, by an 8% jump in fast food prices from a year ago. Grocery prices increased 7.4% as meat and egg prices continue to climb at double-digit rates. The January numbers include a once-a-year revision that affects seasonally adjusted data for the past 5 years. And prices for autos, household furniture, and appliances, as well as other long-lasting goods, continue to drive much of the inflationary surge, fueled by pandemic-related supply and demand imbalances. Now, one thing I think that's interesting, we know how many businesses were shut down and how many had to work from home, and that includes the docks here on the West Coast. And just by way of information, we live in Southern California. We live 4 miles from the water here in South Orange County. And the interesting thing is we're about 35 miles south of Los Angeles. And there's a city called Newport Beach, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It's about 26 miles south of the Port of Los Angeles. And there are barges that line from the Port of Los Angeles all the way down to Newport Beach with goods awaiting being unloaded to tap the Western markets or to feed the Western market, so to speak. So again, saying that this is from the pandemic is a bit ridiculous because it's from not getting product unloaded. And especially if there is, spoilable products out there. Basically, you've got a barge load of trash. If it's foodstuffs or something along those lines, which we do have some that comes in from South America and other places in the country, or other countries rather, in the world. So interesting to see this going on in our world today, where eventually things are going to get so bad that it's going to cost you a day's pay if you're just a working person, and most of us are, to buy one meal for one person. Now, our next story comes from the Daily Caller, and the headline says that big tech censored dozens of doctors' 800 accounts for COVID misinformation. And you can see one of the big tech reps right there in the picture. And the study identified 41 instances between March 2020 and February 2022 in which doctors, scientists, and medical organizations were censored. Major technology companies and social media platforms have removed, suppressed, or flagged the accounts of over 800 prominent individuals and organizations, including medical doctors, for COVID-19 misinformation. As if fact checkers at Facebook know more than doctors about COVID-19 information. According to a new study from the Media Research Center, MRC's Free Speech America Censor Track, an initiative that monitors acts of censorship across online platforms, identified over 41 instances between March 2020 and February 2022 in which doctors, scientists, and medical organizations were censored, according to the results of a study shared with the Daily Caller News Foundation. The study focused on acts of censorship on major social media platforms and online services, including Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Google Ads, and TikTok. Instances of censorship included Facebook's decision to flag the British Medical Journal with a fact check and missing context label, reducing the visibility of a post for a study delving into data integrity issues with a Pfizer vaccine clinical trial. Facebook also deleted the page of the Great Barrington Declaration, an open letter led by dozens of medical professionals, including Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, a Stanford epidemiologist, and Dr. Martin Kulldorff, a former employee of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, which advocated for less restrictive measures to address the dangers of COVID-19. Big tech set up a system where you can't disagree with the science, even though that's the foundation of the scientific method, Dan Gaynor said. He said, if doctors and academic journals can't debate publicly, then it's not science, it's religion. Big tech also scrubbed podcast host Joe Rogan's interviews with scientist Dr. Peter McCullough and Dr. Robert Malone, the latter of which was instrumental in pioneering the mRNA technology. Twitter banned Malone from its platform, permanently in late December 2021 over the virologist's tweets questioning the efficacy and the safety of the COVID-19 vaccine. We tallied 32 different doctors who were censored, including mRNA vaccine innovator Dr. Robert Malone. And again, these people aren't making their decisions based on science. They're making their decision based on the government's narrative that it wants controlled out there in the realm of social media, which obviously has taken over as the major form of communication in these last days. And listen, again, I thought that was such a profound statement that that's not science, that's religion. When you do not allow for debate, the discovery and the exposure of things that are failures. And I had a conversation with someone, a friend who's been a doctor for 35 years the other day. And there was one thing in particular that they said that really struck me, and it was really the catalyst for their looking at the all the vaccines with caution. And it is because of the misinformation that's coming from the medical community. And the comment was even made that, what a shame that you can't even trust those who've been entrusted with your health care. And the comment that they made, I think that we all need to be aware of, is that for the first time in history, a vaccine is presented as lessening the severity of a disease. This doctor said that's a lie. Vaccines don't lessen the severity of a disease. They prevent the disease. There's no such thing as a vaccine that lessens the severity. And they are pitching this because the truth of the matter is people are dying when they've been double and vaccinated and boosted. And they're getting COVID just like everybody else. And the reason they're not dying from it is because most people don't. And vaccines do not lessen the severity of any illness. They prevent it. Let that sink in. It just kind of took me back during that conversation. Now, here's another story, and I want to tie in what we talked about with China. Where's China's role in the last days scenario? And this is something that we mention a lot. And this headline says from the Business Insider that Elon Musk's SpaceX says a geomagnetic storm wiped out 40 of the 49 Starlink satellites it launched into orbit last week. 40 out of 49. Now, the aerospace company sent 49 Starlink satellites into low orbit on Thursday via a Falcon 9 rocket. Around 80% of those satellites were significantly impacted by a geomagnetic storm on Friday. And by the way, we had one just yesterday. SpaceX announced in a statement Tuesday. Geomagnetic storms are triggered by disturbances between the Earth's magnetic field and charged particles from the sun, known as solar wind, according to the Space Weather Prediction Center. The speed and intensity of the storm caused the atmospheric drag to climb to levels 50% higher than previous launches, and SpaceX said in a statement, making it harder for satellites to reach their orbital position. SpaceX said that Starlink tried to fly the satellites in safe mode to reduce atmospheric drag, but they still weren't able to reach their intended destination, and therefore up to 40 satellites will re-enter the Earth's atmosphere and burn up, with some already having done so. Now, the interesting thing about this, I've been watching, and my wife and I watch a lot of British television when we close out our day, and there's a show that's been on that basically it plays out the scenario that there was a coronal mass ejection or a solar flare, G5, class 5 magnetic storm that hit the Earth, broke through the magnetosphere, and basically hit one particular area of the Earth. And it disabled a lot of the things that were used, lighting systems, power grids, and all that stuff. But yet in the program, they still had access to their computers. There were cars that were still out on the road and trucks driving and, all of this stuff. Well, listen, here's where this ties in to the Revelation 16 scenario. The question is, why in the world would an army like China need the Euphrates River to dry up in order to cross over it? Here we live in the age of mechanized warfare. We live in the age of drone warfare. We live in the age of military abilities to launch surface-to-surface missiles that can fly, as we've been talking about, almost 1,000 miles or more. And we've been talking about the fact that there's aircraft that can fly into another country's airspace and take them out. Why would the Euphrates River need to be dried up? Because Revelation 16, in order for this army, the kings of the east, to cross over. And earlier in Revelation chapter 16, we're told the Son was given the power to scorch men's bodies. Now, I personally, and let me just remind you again, I'm not going to be here. I have been born again, and Jesus has saved my soul, and I'm going when he comes to take us to the Father's house, and I hope you are too. But the reality is this, I believe when the sun is given the power to scorch men's bodies, it's talking about radiation burns from negatively charged ions from a solar flare that destroy the Earth's magnetosphere and bombard the Earth and burn men's bodies for a temporary or in a temporary basis. It's not something that lasts forever. It just lasts for however long. They usually last just for a day or so. And basically, unlike this British TV series I mentioned, when a geomagnetic storm of a category 5 hits the Earth, there will be no computers, there will be no cars, there will be no lights, there will be nothing. It will disable everything on the surface of the planet. So if the Euphrates River has to be dried up in order for the kings of the East to cross over it, then that means it's going to be ground warfare. It's not going to be at that point in a tribulation, the military engagement, no nuclear weapons, nothing. It will be foot soldiers fighting with others. Now, again, it's quite a hike from China to cross the Euphrates River. So personally, I believe that the kings of the East are the kings of the East that are Israel's ancient enemies. And they dwell in that territory because the target is Israel. So again, who knows? I have no intention of being here. I plan on watching it from the grandstand. If we're going to be able to see anything, which I don't know that either, I think we're going to be paying attention to Jesus while we're there at the marriage supper of the Lamb with him, and when he rewards us for our deeds done in the body at the bema seat of Christ, and we receive our assignments when we come back at the second coming with him to the earth when he rules and reigns in righteousness, and we with him. Now, here's another interesting story, and it comes from Breitbart. And the headline says, Phil Robertson on cancel culture. They hate people who love God. Duck Dynasty star Phil Robertson reacted to the recent wave of cancel culture on Wednesday, telling Breitbart News Daily the cancel culture mob hates people who love God and that the U.S. will collapse like the Roman Empire if people do not change. It's a spiritual problem we have going on in America, Robertson's told the editor-in-chief, Alex Marlow. These people do not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God. They hate people who love God, and because of this, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done, Robertson said, and they become filled with every kind of wickedness, and he's paraphrasing Romans chapter 1. Evil, greed, and depravity, he continued, they are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They're gossips, slanderous, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. And Robertson added that members of the council crowd are people who have no God, no faith, no love, no mercy. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, and ruthless. And there's a powerful evil force out here. The Duck Dynasty star added, every empire that has ever been, I'm sorry to say, has collapsed, and we are well on our way. So unless there's a change of heart in our people in these United States, this thing is going to implode. And indeed, we are following the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. If you've ever read the novel by Edward Gibbons, and that is, there were, the 5 main features included free food and circuses for the masses, basically welfare, free wine at those events. Also, the growing violence in sports. We all think about the gladiators and things of that nature, the breakdown of the home, as well as the disrespect for religion and government. These are the things that caused Rome to implode. And even though there was a sequence of global empires, not global in the literal sense, but the then known world was conquered. The Babylonians were conquered by the Medo-Persians. The Medo-Persians were conquered by the Greeks. And the Greeks were conquered by the Romans, but the Romans conquered themselves. They imploded, so to speak, only to be revived in the last days. And the United States is following that exact pattern. And I like what Robertson said. He talked about the responsibility of people. And really, that's the problem. I think we often think, oh, we need a new administration. Oh, we need a new government. No, we need the hearts of American people who are voting corrupt people into office to change. Those who are supporting things like abortion and those who are standing against Israel. We, the American people, need to take a stand. And we, the church of the United States, or whatever country you may be watching this in, We are the country's only source of salt and light. And that's why we have a simplistic commission given to us by Jesus himself to go to the world and preach the gospel. The hope for this world is Jesus, not the right political administration. The hope is Jesus. And the problem with America is America's people. And America's people need to repent and come to faith in Jesus Christ. And thankfully, the church here is strong and the church is doing well, even though, we keep seeing reports about the decline in numbers. I have to say, all of those are headed with the word religion, and the decline in religion is happening, but the church is alive and well, and Jesus is coming to get it, I hope, real soon. And I'm sure you would agree with that. Now, a couple more stories and we'll wrap our time up together today. And the first comes from the Christian headlines. And the headline reads that South Dakota becomes the 10th state to ban trans athletes from competing in female sports. And South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem signed a law barring trans athletes from competing in girls and women's sports, making South Dakota the 10th state in the U.S. to do so. Senate Bill 46 is about fairness, Noem said during a news conference after signing the bill. It's about allowing biological females to compete fairly on a level playing field that gives them opportunities for success. She said this during a news conference after signing the bill. And according to Fox News, the governor noted that the bill was based on Title IX, the federal civil rights law that prohibits sex-based discrimination in schools and other education programs. Title IX fought for that for years and years ago. And she said, I've been doing this for years, which started almost 5 years ago now in the sport of rodeo, where we protected girls' events. She said of the bill last month on Fox News. Noem came under fire for vetoing similar legislation, sending it back to the state legislature with revision requests regarding the college sports, which she said would not work for organizations on a national level. She went on to say, I did not veto a bill. What I did was I asked the legislature for changes, and they rejected it. So immediately that same day, I put executive orders in place to protect girls. Now, again, how bizarre is it that a governor has to step in and say biological males cannot compete in women's sports? And yet that's where the world is today, having absolutely lost its mind. And, sadly, some of these people that are so pro-science, so to speak, trust the science. Well, they don't trust the science when it comes to the chromosomal arrangement of human beings and as well as their biological makeup, because a man is a man and there's nothing you can do to change that. You will always have the biology and the chromosomal arrangement of a male. And we shouldn't even have to talk about whether or not men can compete in women's sports. And yet, members of a group in Congress known as the Squad have come out and said things like males have absolutely no physical advantage in competitive sports over women. Well, if that's the case, then why are men breaking women's records by seconds and sometimes even minutes? And why are women who are destined for the Olympics being cut out of the Olympics and other international competitive events because a man is competing in their place? Why are they getting beaten constantly? And if men don't have a physical or physiological advantage in competitive sports, it's just unbelievable the things that are spewed from the mouths of people in places of power today. Christian Headlines also has our last story for the day, where it says that the Biden administration revises policy allowing trans-identified inmates in female prisons. The U.S. Department of Justice recently published new guidelines following trans-identified inmates to be placed with female prisoners. On January 13th, the DOJ's Federal Bureau of Prisons released a 14-page outline of its changes to its Transgender Offender Manual. And again, why is there a Transgender Offender Manual? You are what you are biologically. You may think differently, you may feel differently, but that doesn't change a thing. Scientifically, biologically, and chromosomally, as we said, you are a male or a female, depending upon those things. You don't get to choose, even though you may not like what was chosen for you at birth. Christian Post reports some of the wording from the Trump-era Transgender Offender Manual, released in 2018, was removed in the revised edition. So again, think about what this administration is doing. They are putting biological males in prison with female inmates. Now, do you think maybe a criminal might come up with the idea and say, I'm a woman, I feel like a female? And according to this, they will have to be acknowledged as such and be transferred to the women's prison. And that's just insanity. But that's the world we live in. And things have happened so rapidly. And it's just incredible to see the state that our world is in today. Well, thankfully, we have a hope that is outside of this world. And you know what? I'm so glad that there will be no elections in heaven. There will be only the elect in heaven. And the elect are those who are saved by the blood of Jesus, who of their own free will accepted God's offer of salvation through his only Son, Jesus Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. So again, just amazing times to be alive, but all of them tell us Jesus is coming for us soon. So again, keep us in prayer. Keep Amir in prayer. His back is just giving him fits, and it's just really an awful thing to have a nerve pain and all that. And so please keep him in prayer. And remember, tune in. You can go to the Behold Israel website and find out where the Awaiting His Return conference in Cincinnati on February 19th can be viewed. And then again, if you'd like to join us, you can go to the Calvary Chapel Cincinnati website and join us for a message that I'm excited about on the rapture of the church, because it's called into question. Most Christians don't believe in it. Others say it's heresy. People say it's a Johnny-come-lately in the realm of Bible teaching and all these things. So we're going to dissect it. We're not going to talk about the elements of it that we often get excited about, and that is the proximity of it, and that it could happen today. It's always imminent, so to speak. But what we're going to talk about is the mechanics of it. Is it biblical? Should we be expecting it? What can we know about it? So we'll talk about those things when I teach at Calvary Chapel, Cincinnati on February 20th. So you can go to their website, track them down, and get all the streaming information from there. So that's it for today. Thank you for joining us. I hope you were encouraged and maybe enlightened a bit as to what's going on in our world. And I'm planning on being back next Thursday with you. But either way, we'll see you here, there, or in the air. God bless you.